where are we going to put in the festivals? Let's think, first of all, Passover. Where do we get a reference to Passover? Well, we've got Passover itself. I'll circle it down here in chapter 2. Remember the cleansing of the temple that took place at Passover, and in John's gospel that's early rather than late. Some people think John's moved it so that it can make a point he wants to make. Some of us think that Jesus maybe did it twice. And so, for instance, if Jesus had cleansed the temple in John 2 and created the stir that he did, and then things kind of quietened down, when he did it again in Matthew, Mark, Luke's description of it in that Passion Week, you can imagine that kind of being a catalyst for the Jewish leaders to say, that's it, we cannot let this keep going on. So in my mind, it works quite well to have Jesus do that twice. Some people would say it was only once. Then we've got another Passover referenced in chapter 6, verse 4. And that sets up the whole feeding of the 5,000 conversation. We'll think about that in a minute. And then we get another Passover that is effectively starting in chapter 11, coming through to chapter 19. That's the first Easter, the main one, if you like. So that's Passover zone. We've then got Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, and so we put the Feast of Tabernacles in here, referenced in chapter 7, I think verse 2, but ongoing through 7 and 8. And then we've got the Feast of Dedication, which is technically at the end of chapter 10, but it feels like it kind of embraces 9 and 10, potentially, but at least it's in chapter 10. Now, add to that, we've got a Feast of the Jews in chapter 5, verse 1, but we don't know which one it is. Okay, so we're told in chapter 5, right at the beginning, there's a Feast of the Jews. That's where Jesus healed the man at the pool of Bethesda and stirred up all the trouble for himself. Which feast was that? We don't know. Could be that it was this Passover that is referenced again in chapter 6. But then you've got a slight chronological issue, because 6 verse 4 says the feast of Passover was at hand, it was coming. So to then have the feast already have happened in 5 would put things out of order. So I suspect not. Could have been that he chose to record it that way, or it could have been any of the others. We just don't know for certain. And then the other thing we also want to be aware of in terms of this layout of the book is the feast, the mini feast of the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is hugely important for the Jews, but it wasn't an annual feast, it was a weekly feast. And the Sabbath reference is there in 5, it's there in 7, and it's there in 9. So it keeps recurring quite strongly. So as you look at that, obviously we've got this kind of final week Passover there. But notice there's a sort of a condensed section of feasts in here. Chapters 5, probably through to 12, but yeah, let's extend it. Let's say to there. Okay, so 5 through to 12, that section, which is effectively a section in John's Gospel, it's like feast after feast after feast. You've got the feast in 5, you've got the Passover in 6, Tabernacles 7 and 8, Dedication 9 and 10, and then he raises Lazarus in 11, and then it's Passover at the end of 11, start of 12. And so that whole section is taking us through a calendar of effectively 12 months leading up to the first Easter. If you think about it in calendar terms, back here, we've got, let me write it in, kind of the March, April of the year before. Then we've got the autumn here, September, October time. Then we've got the dedication, which is December, there we go. And then we've got Lazarus fitting in between December and we've got another March, April in here. And so Lazarus is probably being raised somewhere around about February. So you see the progression there of the 12 months really leading up from Easter -1 up to the first Easter. And the interesting thing I find with John's gospel is later on when Jesus gets arrested, if you're used to Matthew, Mark, Luke, when he gets arrested, he is brought before the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin make their big decision that he deserves to die. When you read John, there's no reference of Jesus coming before the Sanhedrin. He's brought before Annas. It feels like a weird little 10 minutes round the back of somewhere as Jesus is getting pushed around and beaten and doesn't honor Annas with any sort of conversation whatsoever. Next thing you know, Jesus is being presented to Pilate. What's happened to the nighttime trial in front of Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin? What's happened to the first light trial to kind of ratify their decision again before the Sanhedrin? None of that's included in John. And I think the reason for that is because he's already established through all of these chapters that for 12 months, Jesus has been effectively on trial. And for 12 months, the Sanhedrin have been very clear what the decision is. He must die. And so for John to then come in, where would it be, up here, and add in the Sanhedrin trial, it's almost a waste of papyrus for him. He's already established that the Jews want Jesus dead. And so it's a fascinating kind of difference compared to Matthew, Mark, Luke. You put them all together and you can make sense of the trials, all of the trials that kind of happen towards the end there. There's actually 6 elements to it, but all of them agree that the Sanhedrin is really significant. John says, yeah, but that was already sorted. And so he gives us more Pilate information. And next month, we're going to spend the session thinking about Pilate, which is fascinating as well.